you've watched any of my videos, you've probably seen a towel underneath my sewing machine. And sometimes when I sew, my machine moves a little bit and it's about to slide off the table. And so I decided to replace the hideous towel with a cute sewing mat. This project is super easy and it's a great way to add stability so that way it reduces some of the vibration from your sewing machine. It's protection to your workspace or your table, and it may even reduce some of the noise that your sewing machine makes. So let's get right into it. You will need some two-sided fusible foam. I picked up some from Joann's, and it's very easy to sew through. It's soft, it's formable, and it's just a really great stabilizer to use, especially for this type of project. I grabbed this pretty floral canvas fabric from Joann's as well. I just thought it was pretty and it'll add a little decoration to my sewing room. And I needed some quilt cotton fabric just so that way I can trim the raw edges around the mat. First, I cut 2 pieces 18 by 18 inches, 1 piece for the outer, which is going to be the top of the mat, and 1 piece for the bottom of the mat. And then I cut a piece of the foam 17 inches by 17 inches, just so that way it was smaller than the measurements of the canvas material to keep it out of the seam while I was sewing. And then after that, I took it over to my ironing board and just gave it a really good press and ironed the fabric back and front to the fusible foam. And after that was done, I took it over to my sewing machine and I sewed around all 4 sides using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I cut off a little bit of the excess seam. To give the mat a little texture, I sewed lines all the way down about a 1/2 inch apart over the entire piece of the mat. And then I grabbed the quilt cotton fabric and cut the trim about 3 inches wide by the length of the entire piece of the mat. You definitely want to add a couple inches to the end, just so that way when it comes time to sew the end together, you have a little bit of room. After cutting the trim, I folded the end of the trim back about a 1/2 inch, and then I placed it along the edge of the mat and just clipped it all the way around. I'm going to show you a technique that's very neat when it comes to turning the corners of the trim, just so that way it looks really neat when you fold it over to the front of the mat and sew around it. This technique is called Mitered Corners, and it's just a way to fold the corners so that way everything looks really neat when it matches up on the other side. I really wanted to use this striped cotton fabric to line the edges of my mat, and I didn't really have enough of it, so it is cut into pieces. That's why you see it like that in the video. But what you really want to do is just make sure you have enough to go all the way around. So when you cut your piece, if you make one of these, you don't, want to cut it into pieces like I did. But I managed to make it work. And then after doing all the 4 corners the same way, I started by sewing a little bit all the way until I got to the end. But then I stopped at the end about a 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to start sewing again. And since I didn't sew the very end of the trimming, now I'm going to go ahead and attach the end together by sewing with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to open the seam, give it a good press, and then sew across that little part that I didn't sew. And now that our trimming is attached to the mat, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over and just cut a little bit of the excess seam off of the edge. And now after pushing my corners out, I'm going to go ahead and fold the trim over and just make sure those corners meet up nice and neat. I'm gonna stick some pins in the trim just to make sure everything is holding in place, so that way I can go ahead and sew all the way around the mat, and we're almost done. And now I'm gonna just sew the trim right at the fold, about 1/8 inch away from the fold, all the way around the mat. Finally, our mat is complete. I'm super excited. I'm going to go ahead and give it a really good pressing just to make sure everything is nice and flat. So that way when I put my sewing machine on it, it looks nice.